Section 7 reviews some of the stuff in sections 2.5 and 2.6, but then it moves on to considering multiple graphs, to considering different types of graphs, and the idea of visualizations of data. And there are so many great tools out there for making great graphs. And pretty much every week, somebody points out to something to me. Hey, did you see this graph in the New York Times? Or did you see this graph on Facebook? It looks really interesting. And I'll take a look at it and say, oh yeah, that is interesting. Or, you know, I don't think that's real. This site right here, Gapminder, has a lot of interesting statistics about the world we live in today. This year, or maybe the end of last year, they added this new section about kind of misconceptions people have about the world. And they have a whole bunch of different topics that you can choose from here. And so I encourage you to check out this site. I'll put it here in the chat. It's in the opening section of the course too. Link. It's just called Gapminder. It's, if you search Gapminder, you'll definitely come across it. So I encourage you to try one of these topics, something that interests you, and take their quizzes. Most people answer these questions wrong, so think about it carefully, and then they give you a bunch of information like, hey, here's how many people, what % of people answered this question wrong, and here's why we think they answered it wrong, and what are the real facts. So there's really cool stuff, and you might find some useful stuff for other classes you're taking here. So just for fun, check it out. What I wanted to take a look at down here is what we were looking at the beginning of class today, their animation of world data. So they have several data sets about countries of the world. So here I've got this bubble chart of income, and their measure of income is gross domestic product per person. So gross domestic product is kind of the wealth of a nation in a given year, and divided by the number of people in the year, in the country. So that's their measure of average income. And then life expectancy is in that country, on average, how long do people live? So here we can see that this country right here, Central African Republic, has pretty low income and a low life expectancy. We have North Korea here, has pretty low income, but reasonably high life expectancy. And then if we head up in this range over here, Japan, high average income, high life expectancy. US is this one right here, high average income, high life expectancy. And again, this is the measure of this average income doesn't like refer to the average person like you or me really. It's the total wealth of the nation divided by the number of people. And our country is quite a bit more skewed, I think, than most in terms of the distribution of wealth, with very few people holding most of the money. Anyway, what we see here in these points is an uphill trend, right? A positive correlation. Now the points are not all the same size, and in this case, the bubbles here are the population. And somewhere it said this on the screen, behind the Zoom buttons. And then they have some information about how to use this if you wanted to go further. A cool thing about this is that they have data over time. So back in the 1800s, they had this data, and then we can watch the countries change over time. And some change dramatically, and some don't. The big ones here, China and India. This is probably the US right there. Great Britain maybe over here, United Kingdom. And at any point, you can pause it and stop to check some things out. And then you can isolate countries by clicking on them over here to have them stand out if there's a particular country you're interested in. And then you can track them through time. And notice it shows the path of that country in time, which is kind of wild and crazy. Let's turn that off. But I thought this was just an amazing, beautiful use of technology and data. And then the other thing is they have a bunch of different data sets you could choose from. So instead of looking at income, you might take a look at child mortality down on that axis and see if there's any kind of relationship between child mortality and life expectancy. And what we can see here is that with an increase in child mortality, we have a decrease in life expectancy. Whoa, that's interesting. Huh, to think about that. I haven't looked at that one before. Lots of different things you can look at here. And you can also change the bubble size somewhere on here. Oh, I think that's down here. Ah, there we go. So you can have the bubbles be something else, like babies per women. And it's going to recalculate everything. Oh, that is, not sure how to interpret that, but anyway, so there's a lot of data here, a lot to think about. So I encourage you to check
an elongated brain.
Oh yeah, it does. So there's a lot of interesting things to think about. It's an amazing use of data, countries of the world over time, and you can play with lots of different variables from each country. All right, so there are tons of interesting infographics out there. I just grabbed a few that caught my attention, and I'll just explain why. This one right here caught my attention the other day. The Bechdel test is a test about how women are represented in movies, and they use 3 criteria to rate a movie. Were there 2 women, fewer than 2 women, or more than 2 women? Right? If there's fewer than 2 women, you fail the Bechdel test. Then next question is, okay, do the women actually talk to each other? Okay, so that's another thing. Okay, yeah, they talk to each other. And then do they talk about something besides men? And if a movie satisfies each of those, there's more than 2 women, the women talk to each other, and they talk about something besides men, then they pass the Bechdel test for a positive representation of women in movies. Now that's a pretty low bar, I would say, given that I have 2 daughters, and this idea of women in society is always a concern to me. But you can look at, say, movies in the 2000s. Less than half of them passed the Bechdel test, and most of them failed. So this column here is 100% of movies that they surveyed, not all movies, but the ones they surveyed in 2000 to 2004 that came out then. And a large proportion failed this minimal test about representation of women in movies, and some passed. So I just thought this was kind of interesting about media in our society. Next one, I was on the subject of women, so I kept going a little bit. This was a beautiful graph here, and it's about 100 inspiring women in architecture, and these were just in Europe. The scale coming out of the origin here is from 1900 to 2020, and so for any particular line heading out, that's the lifespan of the woman. So this woman here was born in the 40s and is still alive in 2020. And if we point to her name, they'll tell us who she is there. And so I just thought this was an interesting graphic in the way they use the spiral and then these sections coming out there for the lifespan of the person. Cute graphic. Popular graphics these days to show data over geographic regions is actually use a map and some kind of scale to go with the map. So here I have a graph of BMI, body mass index, which is an estimate of obesity. And it's the ratio of your height in centimeters divided by, it's the ratio of your weight in kilograms divided by the square of your height in centimeters. And there are lots of BMI calculators out there where you just plug in your height and your weight and it figures it out for you. And darker colors mean there's a higher percent of obese people based on the BMI index in that state. And lighter shades mean there's less obesity in that state. So if we look at Oregon here and we point to it, it'll say, hey, in Oregon, it was about 15.2% of the population was obese in 2008. And in 2018, it jumped almost double, oh my gosh, 29.9% in 2018. And this has been on the national radar for a long time that we have a problem with weight in this country, and that leads to many health problems. So this is just an interesting graphic color coding obesity in different states, like Mississippi's in deep doo-doo there. Right? They're not looking so good. But it looks like here is that Wyoming, Colorado. Colorado, people aren't too bad there compared to other parts of the state. Interesting infographic. Next one's kind of sort of similar to that. This graph here has a color scale about unemployment back in August 2016. And so if you point to a given region, here's Umatilla County where I am right now. In 2016, unemployment rate was only about 5.9%. If we look at this Washington County up here, very Washington, 9.8%, much higher. So they're color coding, and then a lot of these graphics these days, when you point to something, you'll get further information, name of the place, and maybe some data to go with it. So that was an interesting use of a graph also. So infographics, there's a lot of amazing stuff out there. If you come across something cool, let me know, and I'd be glad to share it with the rest of the class. Yeah, BMI can be calculated a bunch of different ways, true. Yeah, obesity definitely is a problem worldwide. But last, I remember checking world statistics, we are kind of in the bottom of the barrel there with an obesity epidemic. And again, BMI isn't necessarily the best indicator of obesity. It's a quick statistic to get, but there are other ways to check on obesity. But obesity is, I think, something to be worried about. All right, one more topic for today. Oops, button.